I remember the EA lawsuit where employees were finally sued because they're like, we're working 100-hour weeks and we're being required to work 100-hour weeks, even though we're salaried employees. And
Vanessa, thanks for joining. So, Vanessa, you are a partner at NEA, New Enterprise Associates. Tell us a little bit about yourself and about your role at NEA.
Mike, thanks for having me. So at NEA, I'm a partner. I invest in both enterprise SaaS and I joke that I do a side hustle in consumer, but mostly enterprise SaaS, early stages, seed, Series A, kind of some Series B, nothing really beyond that. The reason for that is my background's in product. So I didn't come from a banking background. I use Excel with a mouse, so I'm not the best at spreadsheets. And that's kind of the skill set needed for the growth in later stages. So I focus on the very early stages when people are trying to find product market fit, and then when they're trying to scale some of that to test the depth of the market. That's the time I really like getting involved. So my background in product, I actually started off in consumer. I worked at Surface when it was a big table back in the day. I was like, touch technology will be the future. I wasn't wrong, but it was just really dated. And then I worked at Xbox for a while on Connect, led the speech recognition experience there. And then really was seeing what's happening in the Bay Area with startups back in 2010 and decided big company wasn't for me. So I left Microsoft, came to the Bay Area, worked at a startup called Playdom, which NEA had backed, and got acquired within 2 weeks. So I was really devastated. I was like, moved here for the startup dream and then ended up working for Disney. But they left us alone. So I got a taste of the startup bug. So we stayed through some of the earnout. And then I left with a bunch of friends to start another gaming company. So I had my startup for a little over a year. A lot of crazy things happened. It felt like it was a 10-year period. And we ended up getting acqui-hired. And then I left. I was pretty burnt out from gaming and consumer at that point. Still working through some PTSD, to be honest. And then decided to go into enterprise. So I worked at Twilio in the early-ish days. It was about 100 some people. And then Box, where I started in leading the mobile app stuff, really relaunching the iOS app, and then ended up running mobile, and then ended up web app and mobile, and then ended up running a bunch of teams there across the application layer. And then when I came to NEA, I was like, that's what I want to do. I want to invest in application layer SaaS.
Right.
And then the consumer team is really a fun team. So to hang out with them, I was like, okay, I'll help you with companies, but I'm not going to do any investments. And then never say never. I've done quite a bit in consumer as well.
Very cool. Very cool. Sorry to bring it up, but what was the PTSD from gaming and running your own startup? What were
Oh
some
my
of
God. Well, in gaming, at least in social gaming and mobile gaming, you don't make a lot per user if you're
the?
not subscription based. If you're microtransaction based, which was all the rage back in 2012, 2013, you measure revenue and average revenue per daily active user, right? You're ARPed out. And that was like in cents. So I'm like, great, I'm making 15 cents per user per day. So you literally fight for every penny that you get from a customer. Um, and you hit and you grow and you see all this revenue come in. It's really exciting. You see a lot of engagement, but just as quickly as people come in,
Mm,
especially in gaming, people can get burnt out and leave.
yeah.
And we saw that at Playdom, right? And Facebook shut down the ability to post to newsfeed from games. And then just like that, you're at the whim of the platform, right?
Yeah.
Our revenue was like halved overnight.
Holy cow.
And the cost for user acquisition skyrocketed because you couldn't rely on the viral channel anymore. So things happen really fast, both on the upside and on the downside. And so you live in this life of paranoia. I remember I would check my phone, I don't know, like during waking hours, every 15 to 30 minutes, looking at our metrics in our dashboard. And even in the middle of the night, I would like wake up with my heart racing, and then the first thing I do is grab my phone. I'm like, is anything happening? Does any server down? Right? Like, you just live in this state of paranoia all the time. Um,
That's founder life.
Yeah, that's true. I just feel like when you have, at least on SaaS, it's harder. You grind it out on the upside, but you get some signal and then you have time to like save
Hmm.
yourself on the downside. In consumer, when things crumble, it just feels like you're taking, like you're on this like tiny little life raft with holes, and holes are just being poked in everywhere. And you just have this bucket and you're trying to bucket it out and you're sinking super fast and there's no time. But
Much more
enterprise, enterprise founders like, oh, they look at consumer and they're like, look how fast they got to 100 million in revenue. Like, what the hell? What am I doing wrong? Why did I do enterprise? I should have done consumer. And then, things bust or people leave or the fad is over. And then the consumer founder's like, damn it, I should have done enterprise. Look at them. They have recurring revenue. Their customers are locked in for 3 years. Nobody can rip them out. And it's like, like there's pros and cons to each. Um, but
It is.
having lived through gaming, I just had some stuff to work through.
Yeah, it is an interesting distinction. It's funny because I've been in enterprise SaaS for 9 years, and I do have those moments where I'm like, oh, this is so slow. Like, look at these companies, these consumer companies that got to 100 million in a year or two, a couple years, and their user base just blew up like crazy. But you're right, it's much more volatile. Just as quickly as it went up, it can crumble. And the nice thing about enterprise SaaS, at least with our company, and you probably see this with your investments, is it's much more stable and much more predictable. And so you know with the inputs what kind of outputs you're going to get, and you have time to measure it, you have time to test and iterate, and you can plan 3 years out. Like at least when you get to the later stage for us, when we got to about 50 million, then we could look and we can say, okay, based on this, it's pretty clear when we're going to get to 100 million. And that's kind of the benefit of enterprise SaaS. Is that what drew you to kind of the enterprise SaaS world?
Yeah. And the fact that you get to build on top, right? You can launch a product and then you can layer on new products and new features and you can increase the LTV in like a layered approach, right? And then you have most of the time, I mean, SaaS is subscription, right? So like you can layer on upsells, you have renewals, and then you have new customers. So I like this like layered approach to building a business. You have a foundation, you work on keeping that strong and steady, and then you layer on more and more things. And it just feels like you accrue value. On enterprise, most of the time you're just trying to keep your base alive.
Oh, for sure.
And you bring in three new customers, but like two will churn out. And so it's higher churn, it's higher flip over. It feels a lot harder to see the layers one on top of the other.
It's interesting in our business, we've worked with a lot of games and with a lot of non-games, like kind of slower, more mature businesses. What's interesting about the gaming industry is it seems, and at least in in the mobile apps world, is they're the most innovative. They're the ones that are most in tune with their numbers, with customer acquisition costs, with LTV. And it seems like it's because of that, because you're
Yes.
kind of like running on such razor thin margins and things can change so quickly. And you have the platform risk with companies like Facebook, like you said. But they were also the most innovative. They were the ones that really pushed us to innovate on our platform as well. Versus like legacy companies, they're the laggards. They're the ones kind of using the product after many years of after being developed.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And the other thing I would say is in gaming, you're on this content treadmill. So people are working insane hours all the time. Even when you get scale, there's no safety in scale. When I worked at Xbox, I remember the EA lawsuit where employees were finally sued because they're like, we're working 100-hour weeks and we're being required to work 100-hour weeks, even though we're salaried employees. And they won that lawsuit. And at Xbox, I was like, we're required to work Monday through Sunday unless you get director approval to take a day off. And
This is while you're at this is Microsoft. It was part of
yeah,
Microsoft
at
at that
Xbox.
point.
And I remember they called an all hands and they were like, so some of you may have seen the EA news, and we just want you to know you don't like have to work Monday through Sunday, but like if we didn't, we're not going to hit our deadline and then our product is done. So you don't have to if you don't like care about our product going out the door on time. And then like, and just keep in mind, we will give you all of November, December, and half of January off when this is over. So you'll get like all those weekends that you didn't take all in one lump sum. So it's not like you're getting less days off. They're just being reallocated. I was like, oh, that's a really interesting take.
So it was like it was compressed for a deadline of some kind,
Yeah. And this
unsupportable.
is Xbox, right? And it's EA and all the gaming studios. Like everything you're hearing, everyone's making fun of Elon Musk, and there's a lot to criticize on that front and what he's doing at Twitter. But everyone's freaking out. They're like, he's making people work late. I was like, y'all never looked at gaming, huh? Like, you think what he's doing is unfair. Well,
And even startups is funny. On the All In podcast, Jason Calacanis was talking a couple weeks ago about what startups were like in the early,
yeah,
late 90s and early 2000s. And that was, pretty standard work 70, 80-hour weeks, everyone, right?
yeah,
And nowadays there's the push for, heavy work-life balance, and which there's a lot of positivity that comes out of that.
yeah.
But it's different, right? It's
It's
different
different. I mean,
than
I I have very controversial feelings about this because I was at Xbox putting in 100-hour weeks. I moved to the Bay Area, worked at Playdom, and we were working around the clock. I was at Twilio seeing the shift happen. And
Mhm.
once we were 100 people, folks started leaving earlier and earlier, and most people were cleared out by 6. And I remember the OGs being like, what is happening? Like, we haven't made it. We have, by no means have we made it. We have more competition than ever now. We used to not have competitors. And like, why don't people care? Why aren't people like, we have things we really have to launch to stay ahead of the game. Why aren't people like pushing that hard? And I don't know. I mean, I have ideas, but I do think um, you need, I don't know what shortcut there is to the hours, because when you're starting off and you're really early in your journey, uh, in theory, you don't have a lot of resources. So you have to like do amazing things with very few people, right? And that's where the term like the 10x engineer and all that like froofy stuff. I don't love those terms, but it's true. Like 10 people have to do the job of like
Mhm.
100 people. Because in theory, you haven't proven anything out, so you don't have a lot of capital, so you have to prove something with few people. As capital into the asset class exploded, then you got a lot of capital up front. And so people were like, okay, well, instead of 10 people trying to do a job of 100, we could just hire like 40 people right off the bat because we've raised $8 million seed. Um, Here's where I think that's dangerous is one of the benefits of having 10 people is that you can iterate super quickly. There's no meetings because there's no meeting rooms. You're all just like sitting in a room or a Zoom or whatever together, working through things, making decisions incredibly fast and just iterating. The more people you have, the slower you go, full stop. Also, the more people you have, the CEOs are now bogged down with people issues, right?
Mhm.
Instead of like 100% of your time, 10 people focus on that one goal, which is the product, you have 40 people. Now you're doing like career bands. And what are we going to do for, merit increases? And this person reached 2 years. Now they want, so you're just like bogged down in hiring and managing and people things and not the product, not the like product and customer that when you have 10 people and everyone's like, our next paycheck is hinging on the fact that we have to hit this milestone. And so like nobody's talking about anything other than that milestone, not their title, not their merit increases, not their desk or their chair and how or their window seat or whatever. Right? Like
Mhm.
everyone's just like we don't get a pay this whole dream is done if we don't like deliver to this beta customer. And I think that is a hard place to be, but that's how you disrupt. I don't know how you disrupt when you're moving as slow as the person you're trying to disrupt.
Yeah.
And that I think was the biggest lesson that as I look back on these last 4 years where so much capital flew in, like just flooded the ecosystem and flooded it for a long time. So companies that miss milestones left and right just kept getting funded. So I think we did it to ourselves in 2022. It was a hard year. 2023 is probably going to be a lot harder.
Mhm.
But it's because we didn't start on a great foundation. We like smothered companies with cash and gave them more resources than they were meant to have at that. It was just not stage appropriate. So they
Yeah.
had a shaky foundation, and then we kept shoving more capital in, and we built these structures on really shaky foundations, and now there's no capital. Who's going to prop it up?
Yeah. And you're
And
seeing that.
so
You're seeing
we're
that
going
play
to
out.
see a lot more of that this year. It's going to suck.
Yeah, yeah, and you see that the result part one of the results of that is layoffs, but the other result is you have companies that maybe have more organizational headwinds and complexity and bureaucracy than maybe is necessary or is appropriate at this for the stage that they're at. I think
Some
you
of
make
them have gotten too big, Mike, without actual product market fit, or even if they have product market fit, without repeatability in their sales motion.
Mhm.
And so all layoffs do is extend runway. That's it.
Yeah,
But none of these companies are close to break even or profitable. So they will have to raise in 2023 or 2024. And that's when the reckoning is going to come.
yeah,
So
and
2022 was layoffs to extend runway. But at some point, the runway does run out and you have to fundraise. And the fundraise is going to be based on fundamentals. And if those fundamentals are not there for the stage you're at, it's either going to be in, insane down rounds, which is basically like scrapping and almost starting from the foundational level again for these companies, or they're going to cease to exist
yeah.
or get
It's a really
acquired.
it's a really good argument for staying small, not raising too early. Because, like you said, and we saw this, and we were even probably a branch, a victim of it ourselves, when capital was very cheap and you'd get the influx of capital. For us, yeah, we probably got our Series A earlier than we definitely got it earlier than expected or planned. And then what happens? You immediately turn around and you say, "Oh, great, let's go open up hiring. Let's double our go-to-market team. Let's hire these roles and those roles." Next thing you know, you're 50 people, and like you said, you have all this kind of organizational complexity that didn't exist before. And when you're 10 people in a single, and I remember it distinctly. I remember before we were all in a single room. And I remember the moment in which we got split into two separate parts of the office and then eventually onto a separate floor. And that is just kind of like a physical manifestation of the broader problem, which was, yeah, we had to spend a lot more time dealing with people issues, dealing with structures, dealing with all sorts of processes. And I think what people forget is, and I'm a big believer in this, that with each additional person, it's not the complexity and potential causes of or points of friction is not linear. It goes up exponentially. So if you
Mhm.
double your team from 10 to 20, it's not like you have twice as many problems. I would argue you have like 100 times or 100 problems instead of 10 problems. It's
Yeah.
so complex.
Yeah.
And that just gets worse and worse as you cross, like you said, you cross 100, you cross 200, you cross 500. So I think there's a good argument for staying small, not raising too early. And I think you're probably going to see a lot more of that in the next couple of years, right?
Yeah. I mean, I would say that, like, if I was to oversimplify, if you're a seed stage or Series A and your employees are saying they're bogged down with too many meetings, that is like a flashing red flag. That is like, Mayday, Mayday. You overhired. This is the wrong problem to have at this phase. Like, cool your jets, no more hiring, absorb the growth you have, figure out how to streamline. You have the wrong org structure, you have the wrong set of priorities. Like, if you notice that everyone's in meetings 4 to 5 hours a day and you're a seed Series A, stop hiring and rethink everything. That is like not okay.
And I think part of what causes that is a bit of what I'll call ego hiring. And I would say we had a little bit of this at various parts of branch history, where you almost, as a founder, you want to get to the point where you have 30 employees, 50 employees, 100 employees, because you feel like, oh, then I've made it. Then I can tell other people, yeah, I run a 100-person company, but that actually backfires, and it has the inverse effect on your ability to actually build a successful business. I remember a point at which we did an acquisition. We grew from like 150 to 300 basically overnight. And at first, I was like, "This is amazing! Look how big of a company we are." And then it's like, "Oh my God, how much I'm bogged down with
Yeah.
unnecessary stuff."
Here's what worries me. And I think, I'd love to brainstorm how do we get around this, but what worries me is we've, in the last 4 to 6 years, have developed this culture where it's, oh, we're so bogged down. Like, we have more work than we're able to process. We have so many opportunities. We have to move really, really fast. We need these people. We need these people so we can get more done.
Yeah.
Um, the problem with that is that we've become, I think, like my generation of founders, really not great at prioritizing and making the hard decision. Because what we would do back in 2010 when you were at a startup, it was like, oh my God, we're drowning in work. We need more people. And it was like, well, more people is not an option because we can't raise money yet. And so it's like, well, what are we going to not do? And what are we going to do? And we would duke it out in these meetings. I mean, like the pros and cons, it would get so heated and so bad. I'm like, I don't feel heard. And like, this is critical. If we don't do this, the company's over. Everybody had a different opinion of like what would crater the company if we didn't do it. But ultimately, like we came out of like, okay, there's 25 things we want to do, and we only have the bandwidth to do five. And we're gonna have to pick the right five. And it's so uncomfortable because you feel like you're betting the future of your company.
Hmm.
Like, well, if I could do all 25, then we would survive. But if I'm only going to pick 5 of 25, like, what if we pick the wrong ones and we're done? I'm like, yeah, that's like, that's the whole gamble. That is the whole thing you're doing with a startup. You got to be good at picking those 5 things. But in the last 6 years, there's been so much capital, you haven't had to make those trade offs. And so, like, how do we take a whole generation of employees, executives that have grown up in this world where they don't have to choose A or B, they get to do A, B, and C?
Yeah.
And these are people that are going to go start companies. Like, how do we reframe what it takes, right? To be like, you are going to take a lot of risk. You are going to make hard decisions all the time. And you're going to make trade offs every day that you have not used to making. Like, how do we do that?
I think that's so spot on. And we saw it over the last 9 years. And I think the next couple of years is going to be a big learning and a big teaching moment for a lot of people, whether they be executives, whether they be people that start companies. It's this concept of doing less, but I saw it. I saw it over the last 5, 6 years, where it was very easy to say do it all. And I think what we were doing when we did that was we were hedging, right? Like we think it's
Yes.
A, but like we have the capital to be able to hire people to do B and C.
Yeah.
And I think over the last like year, well, I think really when COVID hit, and then over the last couple of years, at least with us, what we started to do was we started to, before it was very centralized and founder-led approvals, where it was like, okay, go to a founder or go to like the committee to get approval for a headcount or whatever. And we tried to start building budgets and constraints for people. And those constraints were incredibly important. Those constraints were what helped people understand, oh, there's trade-offs. It's not just like this infinite funnel of money, but instead, I have to make this hard decision. And by being able to give people, okay, here's your budget, and they say, oh, but I want to hire this extra person. I'm like, okay, but you don't have the budget for it. So is that person going to be more important than, or that role going to be more important than this other role headcount you have allocated? And then they choose. And that was a really fascinating mindset shift for people. And I think that's what you're going to see happen over the next couple of years, just on a broader scale.
We have to get there. I mean, that's how you build business. Startups aren't supposed to hedge. There is no hedge. You're supposed to take the leap. It sucks. It's super uncomfortable, but like that's kind of what it is. That's why the asset class has such upside. It's supposed to have downside. If you eliminate the downside, you eliminate the upside, and then you just have these like not very strong and sturdy and durable businesses.
Yep. Yeah.
It's going to be interesting. What I'm really fascinated by is that like the people that are joining startups now, right? The young, then like the next cohort, the next generation, they're going to see what happens when you take too much capital. What happens when you overhire, right? What happens when you don't meet your milestones? And so they'll be founders someday. I'm so curious about how they'll impact the companies they build and how they build them. And then for our generation and for the executives in our teams, like I think this is going to be a hard lesson, but I think they'll come out of here a lot stronger, right? And they'll be founders again, or they'll be executives at other startups, and they will have the battle wounds that were not pleasant to acquire, but there'll be lifelong lessons, and some days they'll be advisors and board members to that next generation. And so I do think there's going to be like a massive shift in how people build businesses in like 10 years from now,
Yeah.
hopefully less.
Yeah, hopefully, definitely. Yeah. I go back to this saying that I've heard, which is good times create weak people create bad times create strong people create good times. And I think we're in a period of bad times right now, but what that's going to do is create this set of stronger people, stronger founders, stronger employees, startup employees that will eventually kind of create those good times again.
Yeah. Yeah.
And hopefully it doesn't create too much of a bubble, but it is cyclical. It is pretty
Yeah.
fascinating to kind of see.
100%. It's amazing to see it. In the grand scheme of things, like 5 to 6 years is not a big cycle, right? And so it's actually these cycles are pretty tight looped, which is both a blessing and a curse, right? It means next year is going to be brutal, but hopefully we'll come out of it. We'll come out of it in 2024. We'll come out of it in 2025, and then we'll see that next cohort.
it's going to create a lot of really good discipline. Um,
Yeah.
did you see recently, talking about meetings and kind of the organizational headwinds that come from that? Did you see recently the Shopify
Yeah.
announcement about killing basically all meetings that have more than or recurring meetings that have more than two people in them? Any thoughts on that? And then kind of like that philosophy in general of minimal meetings?
It doesn't work unless you do like a fundamental restructure.
Mm,
Like I hope that came along with a reorg or something, because if you have that many meetings, it just means you have poor processes, poor decision making. There's too many stakeholders and decision makers in any given process. So I don't think that works unless you streamline it, um, quite a bit actually. Because
yeah.
now, like, if humans are amazing, right? Like, we can get around everything. So if the rule is no more than one meeting with two people, you might end up with like, okay, a giant game of telephone. Okay, like you tell so and so that we made this decision, and then like so and so will have to talk to so and so to get their feedback. Like, without a reorg or restructure and how decisions are made, that might like 10x the number of meetings to get anything done. So
And
I
delay.
saw that and I was like, I feel like there's the other half the sentence they forgot to write on this blog post or this press release.
Definitely creates some a lot of complexity in other ways because we've experimented with various different things, and I've yet to figure out a way that makes sense where you can eliminate most meetings and still get people the context and information. I think there are a lot of positives where people then feel more empowered to make decisions, where people don't wait for an upcoming meeting to solicit information or solicit, maybe context on something. But there are a lot of, I think, challenges that come with that. But I like the concept in theory. I just implementation, I think, can be incredibly hard.
I like the concept too. I think the one thing I see missing a lot in when companies get bigger is that people don't understand why we're doing what we're doing. And therefore, don't feel empowered to make the decision because they don't really know what they're rowing towards, right? Like you have
Mm,
all these people and you're like, we want to deliver X, but they don't know why we want it. Like there's so much context missing. Like why X? What are we trying to accomplish with X, right? Is it we're trying to increase revenue from this specific customer base and this is the need we identified. So if everybody has the understanding of like what we're trying to capitalize on, how we're going to measure it and why, then I feel like you can break it out and then you can hopefully trust every sub team to make the right decisions to get us to where we're trying to accomplish.
yeah.
And then there has to be trust. It sounds super cheesy, but I find that in the things that we try to move fast on in tech, sometimes are the wrong things. And you have to build initially a foundation of trust. You have to trust the other team to make the call. You have to trust the engineering team that they're going to make the right trade-offs on the tech that they're going to take on. You have to trust that the designer is making the right compromises to hit the deadline, right? And I actually like spend, and it sounds super like hippy dippy, but the truth is, spending the time to like untangle why there's no trust there. Like, why are you reviewing why is there four reviews for the designer, right? That's to me, that's like a sign of lack of trust.
Yeah.
Like, tell them what we're trying to do. We should have one review at most, right? Same thing with the engineering team. Like, okay, they didn't deliver the spec the designer gave like spot on, but trust that they did this for right, not that because they were
Mhm.
lazy or because they didn't like look at every pixel, but because they wanted to meet the deadline and the deadline's more important than getting this pixel right.
Yeah.
I mean, like everybody's making trade-offs. You have to have the trust that they're making the right trade-offs. And I find that like the meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting is because there's a breakdown in trust that people are making the right decisions.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. And I think that's the foundation for kind of all the productivity and the positives and the negatives. And I think that's something that we saw. It's so hard to build that level of trust as you scale, because what we experienced was really twofold. Hyper growth over the last few years, which led to a lot of new people coming in, lacked context, lacked information, and lacked that base level of trust, compounded by a work from home environment. Because I think a lot of that trust, what we found
Bingo.
before COVID, was a lot of that trust was getting built in person, in kind of like the informal interactions that you have in the office and like the side conversations and the lunch conversations and just being in a meeting or pulling somebody aside and saying, "Hey, what do you think about this?"
Yeah.
And that built a lot of camaraderie. And I think the challenge with especially hybrid or remote work is it's harder to build that level of trust. You need to find ways to build that level of trust. And you also need to do it from a leadership perspective. And I think that's one of the things where I could have done better as we scaled, especially, which was relinquish control and instead make sure that we're setting the right vision, setting the right objectives, setting the right priorities, and then trusting and empowering people. And we did it to some degree, but I think we could have done it more. And I think part of that was just because it was so chaotic the last few years.
Yeah,
But
I
that
mean that's an
built
argument for like scale slow, right? Like I don't know that you should more than double the size of your company a year. Like I don't
yeah,
think that's right.
that was our rule. Do
Yeah.
never double the company more than double the company in a year. I think that's a great rule. You see
Yeah.
companies that are 5x in a year.
Yeah, when people and I feel like people talk about trust in the like, oh, in the Zoom world, it's hard to build trust. I want to put a fine point, like test yourself. Do you believe that this team will make the right decision if you are not there? If the answer is no, there is no trust. And then
Yeah,
figure out what would it take for you to be able to let them make decision in the room and be comfortable with what they come out with.
yeah,
Whatever it is you need to do to get there, go do that. But there's like a very clear litmus test, right? And I think people should be asking themselves that frequently. And if it's like we should all do a retreat together, or it should be we need to go in depth with a customer, or I want them to hear it directly from the customer so they know exactly what they're struggling with, because I don't believe that they understand the real problem. Like whatever it is that you believe they need to know or be like fully ramped up on so that you trust that they can make the right decision and you won't ever say a word about it, like go do that thing. Like go get confidence that the decision will be done and that you assume that you won't be able to say a peep after it gets made. Like operate under that assumption. I think you're going to be okay.
yeah. And I think what's hard as a founder is in the early days, you probably know everything about the
Yeah.
business and you've probably done everything. So you have a lot of context. And I think there's a point at which it's not necessarily clear when, there's a point at which it switches where you actually have less context. And I found this when people would start to bring to me a decision and they'd say, "Mike, what do you think?" And I'd say, "I'm going to make the worst decision here because I don't have the context. I'd much rather you guys figure this out." And
Yeah.
that was like a really interesting point or realization of, yeah, at some point as a founder, as a leader, you don't have enough context to make the right decision. And instead, the actual better thing is to empower your team to be able to do so.
Yeah, I think that that's right. That's also the trickiest point because if you get to that point in your Series A, you are likely going to fail. If you get to that point in your Series B, it's questionable. Series C and D is when we see like the most successful companies hit that inflection point for the founders. But if it comes too soon, most of the time you're toast.
And why do you say that?
Because you're still trying to find product, you're still iterating, you're still trying to find product market fit, and the the crux, like the kernel of the reason for the company existing, still lies within the founders, and
Hmm.
you haven't cracked it open yet. And so, like, you think about it as like a nuclear reactor, like that's the core, and you have to figure out how to harness it. And so, you and the 10, 20 people around you are trying to figure out how to harness this thing that you guys had, guys and gals had, like in your core. And so, if the founders get removed before that's like harnessed it and brought into the world in a way that people can consume and believe, you're soulless. Like you have nothing. You have nothing.
I think that's a really nuanced and fine point, but it's a super important one, which is like it's this weird balance where as a founder, you need to be involved in basically everything, every little detail with the company until a certain point, but then at some point it flips, and at some point it becomes counterproductive if you try to be involved in everything. And I failed in terms of I was too involved in stuff longer than I should have been, and then at some point I flipped and said, okay, I need to get out of as many of these details. But it's like it's not clear exactly when that is, but at some point that needs to flip. And I see some founders do it too early, like seed stage, they get to 10 employees and they're like, okay, I don't need to be on customer calls anymore. I can just outsource this to my one salesperson that I hired. I don't need to do that. And like, I just need to delegate at this point. And I'm like, no, it's
Well,
like,
here's the trap. Founders start delegating the stuff they don't like to do.
yeah.
That's the trap, right? It's the, ooh, I just raised a Series A, or I just raised my seed. I fucking hate selling. Sorry, you can bleep that out. I don't like having to sell or cold calls. I'm gonna like hire someone and they're gonna take care of all of that for me, and then they get completely removed. And
Hmm.
it's like, no, you still have to stay and all the stuff you don't like to do too, like well beyond when you want to hand it off, unfortunately.
Yeah.
And so that's because it might seem obvious, like, oh, well, of course I'm going to stay involved in all the details until I'm like Series C. But you don't realize how tempting it is to hand
Mhm.
off the details of the stuff you don't like to do sooner than later.
And arguably, some those are some of possibly the most important details. I remember I was doing SDR phone screens well into Series B, Series C stage. And I remember somebody looked at my calendar and like, dude, you've got 6 SDR phone screens today. Like, that's not good. You should hand that off. I'm like, I care so much about, I hate it. I hate doing SDR phone screens, I hate doing interviews, but like, I have to do it because
Yeah.
we gotta hire these people. And it was a much more impactful or effective method to have me do the phone screen, which then I could quickly, I was so experienced at that point, I could quickly tell whether somebody should pass through. And then they were more excited because they got to interview with a founder rather than like some junior recruiter or sourcer. And that led to us getting higher quality people, which then fed the whole go to market motion. But like that was one of those things, like you said, I really wanted to delegate that, but I was like, this is so important for us as we're scaling that I did it way longer than I think a lot of people would otherwise do.
Yeah. But that, some founders might hear that and be like, of course. I mean, I don't love doing SDR stuff, but I know how important it is. So I would never hand that off. But there's other stuff that's less obvious, like, oh, I don't like dealing with this HR stuff, or man, I'm spending so much time recruiting. I'm going to hire a recruiter and have them take care of it.
Mm.
And it's like, no, no, that stuff matters too. Who you bring in as your 11th, 12th, 13th, 21st, 28th employee is like a key puzzle to this map, and a key puzzle piece to this map. And like, you've got to get like the exact hire. And it might take a long time and it might be really frustrating. But if you get the right person in, it like magnifies everyone else's efforts too.
Mm.
You get the wrong person in, it sets you back a few months. And so, like, get the right hire. So don't outsource to this recruiter you just brought in the first PM hire, right? And then there's like, oh, well, I don't want to deal with like writing the employee handbook and policies and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, you kind of have to, because whatever policy you set up has to map up with like your true values and how you want to build this thing, because it needs to be present in how you make every decision, from hiring and firing to who gets promoted to the compensation bands to what's maternity and paternity leave. Like all of those things need to reflect what you really believe it should be, given how you want to build this and what you want to build and what time frame you want to build it in. And so like, you can't delegate even like the mundane stuff that you think doesn't matter. Like you can't. You just can't.
Yeah. And I think that gets, we were very fortunate. I think that's spot on. We were very fortunate. We had 4 founders, right? So we kind of, and all kind of very different backgrounds. So to some degree, it worked really well where we had enough coverage on everything that we had a founder covering everything for the first, through the first 100 employees or so. There's a big challenge with companies that maybe have one founder or, even maybe they have 2 founders, but it's hard to cover everything.
Yeah.
Any advice you have, like how do you think about that, especially as an investor now? How do you think about that when you look at like a solo founder starting a company versus maybe a team that has 3, 4 people?
It just comes to a prioritization. It Even solo founders, they end up being really, really thoughtful about who they bring in as the second and third and fourth hire. So they may not be co-founders, but the founder has thought very deeply about who they're bringing on, why they're bringing them on, in which order they bring them on. Um, and they work so closely from the beginning that a lot of that founder DNA gets permeates from them too. Um, it's a different way of building a company than having 4 co-founders, but in some ways it's more streamlined, because when you have 4 co-founders, the culture, like the beating pulse, is like some combination, some may say lowest common denominator, of 4 people's opinions and passions. And then when it's one founder, it's like a very clear, like
Yeah.
beating heart. This is it. This is what I believe. This is how we're going to do it. Right. And everyone that joins, like, believes in that vision, is going to go, like, make that happen, or doesn't and doesn't join.
Mm, I
And
love that.
it's just a different, like, there's pros and cons of how you do it, and you can be really successful in either. And sometimes you four founders may have had more time spent discussing and arguing different paths than the solar founder. But they spend more time having to do all the other tasks that you may have assigned to other
Mm,
co-founders. So there really is no shortcut.
yeah.
And there
Yeah.
really is
No,
no, like, everyone's, there's pros and cons to every path.
the amount of time that we needed to spend, especially in the first year or two, aligning constantly to make sure that we were presenting a united front and kind of single message. Yeah, it was high. And then we could distribute and then go
Yeah.
and do other things. That's really fascinating.
But with a
Okay,
solo
so
co-founder, you don't have that.
yeah, yeah, that's interesting. I love that. So as you look towards this year, next year, from the investor side, if you were a founder starting a company right now, what advice, like what would you be doing? How would you approach fundraising? And what advice do you have for people starting a company right now?
Expectations is what causes disappointment. So if you expect the environment to be what it's been in the last 3 to 4 years, you may be very disappointed and have a really hard time. If you want to create expectations for what it should look like and feel like, look back to what it was like to fundraise in, you don't have to go that far back, like 2014, 2015.
Mm,
Look at what were the valuations then? What were the milestones people had to reach then? How did people build those companies then? Because I meet with a lot of founders, like, how am I supposed to launch a product with only having raised 2 million bucks? I was like, so many people launch products having raised less than $1 million. And now it's kind of easier because you have all these tools and APIs, and you have AWS, you have, like, all of this
so much
stuff that didn't
easier.
exist back then.
Yeah.
So it's possible. I swear it's possible. Just reframe it. Go figure out how they did it back then so you can reframe your expectations on what it's like to build a business. Um, the other thing I would say is find the right investors. Before, when things got really frothy, it was like, well, all money is green. And I think in 2022, we found out that, like, maybe that's not the case. And in 2023, we're really going to see what people are made of. So try to find the right investors. I get the price sensitivity. I get founders don't want to get diluted. Look, I don't think it's right for an investor to dilute a founder to the point where it's, like, not meaningful for them to spend 10 years of their lives building something. The other thing I would say is, if you do get more diluted than what you wanted at the seed or A, it doesn't mean that that's your dilution forever, right?
Mm,
Something people don't talk about is there are founder refreshes and grants. They're more milestone based in the series in the later stages, but it does exist, and it does make up for, like, a really compelling compensation package in the later days. So don't get discouraged if you raised a Series C and it wasn't, on a $20 million cap or whatever. Like, it's okay. If you build a great business, it will even out. Not just, oh, the pie gets bigger and so your percentage is worth more. Outside of that, you can get, like, some of your equity back. You can get equity refreshes. And so there's still hope. I would say focus deeply on just getting that thing off the ground. Focus on building real value for your customers and demonstrating that, and finding the right investors that are going to believe in that value.
for somebody that's early stage, what did how should they think about finding the right investors, especially somebody that doesn't have the network, right? Because it's easy for somebody that knows people in the to say, "Oh, I know who I'm going to go talk to." But if you're a founder and you're building something, how would
Yeah.
you suggest they go start even building those relationships?
Well, okay, there is a hack. So, Mike, I've taken 100% of the intros you have sent my way. I will always take an intro from a founder in our portfolio 100% of the time, no questions asked. I will do it. Um, so if you're an early stage founder, you don't have a network, but uh, you wanted to meet NEA, go get one of NEA's portfolio companies or a few of them as design partners or customers or advocates or whatever. If they're using the product, that's a really good way to get an investor's attention. Most of the time, a lot of the companies I reach out to is because I hear my startups talking about them,
Mm,
about how we're using this new whatever HR tool, or we're using this new go to market tool, and it's been game changing. I'm like, what's the name of the company? Let me see. Sometimes I have to sign off on big procurement purchases, and I'm like, when we see the budget, right? I'm like, oh, what's this software? Why are we spending so much on that? They're like, oh, it's the best thing ever. I'm like, oh, I need to go find those founders.
yeah.
Um, so sell into the portfolio, I think, is like the quickest hack if you're a B2B company. And then ask those founders if you've served them well as the founders of that portfolio company, can you get an intro to someone at your different investment firms that have invested in your company? If you're a consumer, that's a bit harder. So I would just look at investors that have invested in parallel things. A big waste of time. I get a lot of, for instance, I invested in Majuri. It's a jewelry D2C company. I got a ton of founders in jewelry being like, oh, you invested in Majuri, you should look at us. I'm like, well, no, I already made, like, we're not competitive. I'm like, no, no, but here's the thing. Like, I already invested in that, like, category.
Mhm.
I have to diversify my portfolio. I'm not going to invest in like two jewelry companies. Invested in a postpartum care, and everyone's like, oh, well, this is like postpartum, but in a different area. I'm like, well, I already picked, like, it's too specific.
Yep.
So yes, if I do marketplaces, I will look at another marketplace company, but ideally in a totally different industry than some of my other investments. So you want to find an investor that invests in the category, but hasn't invested in your industry.
I see. Yeah. I think
I get
that's
a lot of those. I'm like, that's a total waste of time.
wonderful. And probably building relationships over time with investors, not when you need to raise, but before that.
Yeah, that's hard, right? Because you only have bandwidth for some of those, so you need to at least know you're going to convert some. And same
Yep.
thing for the investor. They only have bandwidth for a dozen of those a year to like maintain a relationship. So they likely won't do that unless it's something that they're really interested in, or
Mm,
something an industry they've spent a lot of time investigating, and they just really want to know how companies are doing. So again, you still have to find the right match even to propose that.
yep. I think that's spot on. It's something that you hear that a lot, right? Build a relationship before you need to invest, but it's hard to do so. I love the approach of selling to the portfolio companies of the investor that you ideally want to meet.
That's the fastest, quickest way to get to it. And you don't have to take the investor out for coffee 12 times in a year, right? You just be like, I sold to Branch. They love it. We've tripled the size of the account in less than a year. They're like, Mike, don't you love our tool? Can you introduce it to Vanessa? And you'd be like, hey, we love this thing. But like 100% I'm gonna take that meeting. And it's very likely I'll invest too.
Yeah. Yeah. So spot on. I love that. Wonderful. Vanessa, really appreciate it. Thank you. Really great insights today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's always great to chat.